Hi, everybody. Today I wanted to give the testimony of my father, who was saved by the Lord Jesus Christ at 79 years old, so it's never too late. When I was young, my dad wanted to be a pastor, and as life would have it, he ended up having to go work for my grandfather. And with the pressures of working in that business, he did a lot of socializing, a lot of drinking, and then later on he turned to alcohol to help him deal with some of the business downturns. It did not help my parents' marriage like it doesn't help a lot of other marriages. And by the time I was a junior in high school, my parents were divorced. When I was a senior in high school, my dad showed up at my workplace with his Duke girlfriend, a bleach, blonde, bubbly, skinny alcoholic. They were both snockered. I was so embarrassed, but he left, and not too many years after they got married, their marriage fell apart too. It just wasn't good. And then he met a wonderful woman who was a Christian that would not marry him unless he did something about his alcoholism. So that relationship ended, and he met another woman at what I would call a dance club, but it's a dance studio where they actually get to dance with different partners and learn different kind of dances. And they got married. She was a believer, but I would say the lukewarm believer. She didn't go to church. She did as a child, but not as an adult, and she didn't have any children. They were married, and he helped her become an alcoholic too. And he had decided, and she had decided, they did not want to retire in the Houston area. And so he wanted to move to South Florida and have a house built there. So he had a house built there. And not even a year after they moved, his third wife came down with Hep C and liver failure from the alcoholism. And she could not be put on the transplant list because she wouldn't stop drinking. So she died at a local hospital, and my dad swore he would never step foot in that hospital again. So a few years went on, and he went to a high school reunion and met up with a lady he knew in high school. Coincidentally, they always had the same last name, so they always sat next to each other. So they knew each other pretty well. And the difference is she is a Christian, and she wouldn't do the drinking. My dad had a friend that got sick, and he knew that I did prayer, and he asked me to pray for his friend. See, Jesus is getting involved now. And I wrote that prayer for his friend. He gave it to his friend, and that friend recovered. My dad was going to have to go in for a hip surgery. And he had another friend that got sick, and he asked me to go ahead and write a prayer for that friend. And I did, and he sent it to that friend, and that friend was also recovered. So when it came down to him and his hip surgery, he asked me to write a prayer for him, which I did. And his hip surgery went really well. Part of the hip surgery requirements, though, is he had to stop drinking, which he did, and he had to lose weight. He was about 350 pounds at the time, and he dropped down to 180 pounds, within, by the end of a year. And the surgery went well. Recovery went well, but what we didn't know is at the Step Down Center after the hospital, they allowed alcohol. So guess who started drinking again? And after he was deemed strong enough to go home, he started drinking a lot. And he had started putting on a lot of weight, and he started falling on that leg that had the hip replacement. And he had fallen about 3 or 4 times. I had talked to him a few times and recommended he go see a specialist in Tampa, which he did. He did have infection in that hip. He had some loose screws, and the doctor was able to clean out the infection and put him on an antibiotic regimen and get the screws retightened in his hip. So he was doing much better. But after that surgery, he was wheelchair bound. And so they decided to go ahead and sell their house and move to an old Florida home in a neighboring city. And little did they know that the house next door was owned by an Episcopalian pastor. And so they moved and got rid of all their furniture. The house was already furnished. And the Episcopalian pastor, I'll just call pastor for now, decided to befriend them. So any of you pastors out there, it's good for you to ask the Lord if you have any neighbors that you need to befriend, to make friends of, because the Lord will tell you. And so they started watching together this pastor on television on Sunday mornings. Well, about 2 years before COVID, me and my son went to go see them. And my dad was pretty much wheelchair bound at that point. He could do minimal stand up, but he was wheelchair bound. And there was some concern the infection was coming back in his hip. So we had a great time during our visit. And then about 2 years later, COVID hit. And I was very concerned for both of them because they're getting up in age. My dad learned during COVID he could order alcohol online and have it delivered to his house. How about that? And so one night when he was drunk, he fell out of his wheelchair in the bathroom and cut his foot really bad. And so his wife had to load him up in the car, take him to the local hospital, which happened to be the hospital that his other wife had died at. My dad was livid, but it was COVID. And so they brought him in, fixed up his foot really well. I talked to him. He was so impressed how well they took care of him. But at that point, they had to keep him 14 days. That was a requirement. And he had to go through alcohol withdrawal. And let me tell you, it was bad. It was bad. Some days he would just call his wife's name over and over and over all day long. It was bad. So that doctor had talked with the doctor in Tampa, and they decided that they would release him to a step-down unit, but that way they could control to make sure he didn't have any alcohol. So they did. And he had some appointments to and from Tampa in the meantime. But he couldn't see my stepmother only if it was to take him to Tampa. And each time he came back, he had to stay another 14 days. Well, about halfway through with that, he had had enough of that. And he called me one night and said he was breaking out of this place. And so he called 911 and had him taken out of that place. And the doctor in Tampa put him in the facility that he recovered from his hip surgery. And he was delighted because they knew that that facility would let him out and have alcohol. But the doctor ordered no alcohol. So he was furious when he got there and he couldn't have any alcohol. So he was later transferred back to Tampa. They were going to go ahead and go back in to surgery with that hip. And while his surgery was delayed because of his blood pressure was just through the roof. And so while he was there, a pastor came to see him. And he realized that this was the time he needed to reconcile with the Lord. And so that pastor brought him through the sinner's prayer. He reconciled with the Lord at that time. Unbeknownst to me, while this was going on, I was driving to work one morning. Okay. And here I am driving down the highway, and I can see just fine. And then I notice a book opens in front of me. Okay. A blue book just opens in front of me. And I can still see through the book, and I'm still driving. And I notice on the left side of the book, I'm having a vision. If y'all haven't figured that out yet, on the left side of the book, I could see my two youngest sons. Their names were written in pencil. And I understood that because they were still young and they hadn't made the adult commitment, for Christ yet. So I saw a hand come out and write my father's name in ink, blue ink, in his handwriting. The book was closed. Now, this book was a big book. It wasn't a small book. And the book turned and it had a volume number on it. And then the book was put up and the vision ended. Well, 2 days later is when I got the call that my dad had accepted Christ. And I was totally elated. My dad was happy. He had no desire for alcohol anymore. And so a few days later, he had a surgery. Well, the surgery didn't go so well. And I was keeping in constant contact, and so was my sister, with our stepmother. And she was very hopeful. And by the time we realized he had pneumonia, my sister and I were starting to realize that this was not good. And so I took a flight down there and I called my sister and I said, "You need to come down." Dad was in bed and they had to take the hip replacement completely out. And his eyes were open. He would blink if you put your hands close to his eyes, nonverbal, nothing. And then the doctor came to see me and my sister 2 days later and let us know he had sepsis and that he recommended, since I had the power of medical attorney, to go ahead and let him go into hospice and let him die. And he died probably about 4 days later. But the Lord let me know that my dad was with him. And I just wanted to share this testimony with you, because if you have a loved one who is going through alcoholism or drug abuse or any horrible thing, pray for him. Okay, pray for them, pray for her, and keep praying. I know I prayed for my dad from the time I was in high school all the way up until, I saw that vision. I prayed for him. I even would plant seeds, check seeds at church and put them in the offering plate. Okay. I would talk to the Lord about my dad. I know his sister prayed for him. My sister prayed for him. All of us were praying for him. But he's the one who finally had to make the decision. I remember about 10 years ago, I was in Sunday school and I was telling my Sunday school about my dad. And one of the ladies looked at me and said, "Is your dad dead yet?" And I said, "No." And she goes, "Well, there's still time." And it's something to remember. There's still time. The Lord has not come yet. There's still time. They have not died yet. There is still time. So continue to pray for those whom you love who are going through difficulties in their life. I hope this is helpful to you, and I hope you enjoyed this testimony from my dad, who is now in heaven. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.